Hey folks, so I've been asked a lot to do some tips about how I take and edit concert photos, and I'll get around to doing the shooting one, but right now I'm just going to provide a quick tip for editing. A lot of times when people get started doing concert photography, they start in small venues, which is what I do, and it's where I prefer to shoot. But the one problem is when you shoot a lot of jazz clubs and bar scene kind of places, you get venues that have just kind of weird lighting setups that are kind of poor. Usually they're using kind of funky colors, which normally is okay. I like to shoot in auto white balance, and then I correct it in post. The only problem is when people, or rather when venues use red lighting systems, it can be very difficult to correct. So here you can see this is a job I did for Todd Carey last week in New Jersey at a venue called Crossroads. And just their lighting system was pretty much all red. They had some blue lights behind the performers, but you really could never see those. So if you pull it into Lightroom here, I'm going to show you how to take an image like this after I've already done some just basic adjustments, but I'm going to show you what you can do with the color correction options in Lightroom and Photoshop to turn your image into something a little more like this sort of look. It's starting to look a lot more correct and accurate for what we actually saw. So the first thing I really want to recommend to anybody when they're editing this type, or shooting rather, is to make sure that you're shooting in RAW. And if you don't know what that is, I definitely recommend jumping on Google real fast and looking that up. But what you can do is if you set your camera to RAW files they absorb a lot more information than JPEGs do, so you actually have a lot more to work with when you're editing the photos later. So the first piece of advice is a pretty obvious one, is to go over to the white balance option here on your basic editing in Lightroom. And what I usually like to do is use this selector option right here and find something white in the image, or rather something completely black, and you use that and it just gives you a starting point. So you see already the image is looking much better, much more realistic. So I kind of got away easy on this because Todd happened to be wearing a white jacket. For this, some people might think to click the white over here. The problem with the white here is if you click it, often you get, okay, that one worked, but what happens a lot is you'll get an error where it says that you've actually blown out that part of the image and that the highlights are too high. And sometimes what looks very white in an image, actually there are no pixels. There's no information in the pixels because it's too white. So usually I try to click on clothing. Sometimes I actually click on the person's skin because skin tone is normally pretty close to a neutral, and then you can mess with it from there. Another good suggestion is if somebody's not wearing white and there's no white that you can really see on the screen, is to try to find a picture where the performer's teeth are showing, because teeth are generally supposed to be white. Excuse me, and a lot of times what happens is you'll have to correct it a little bit after the fact, but it actually gets you on the right track pretty well. Usually it ends up being a little too blue when you use the teeth because teeth have a tendency to be a little bit yellow, but it puts you in the right area. So the problem with red is, as you can see, there's still a lot of red around his face, but we've already maxed out our temperature tint. So the next thing I'm going to suggest for people is to start doing selective color editing, which is a tool that a lot of people stay away from. But what you do is you go into your color option, and I like to click all, have all of it visible. You can click the individual ones also, but I just like to have all showing, and then you can just scroll and all three are visible. So the first place that I start with is luminance. Luminance is how bright each individual color in the image is. So you can use this to selectively make certain colors brighter or darker. And one thing about adding brightness is it does kind of reduce how powerful the color looks. So for example, you see how red this background, this crossroads sign is? If I were to up the reds on that, not only is this brighter, but it also seems a lot less red. Now I'm going to double click that to make that go away because that's not the actual edit I want to do. A lot of people's faces tend to be reds and oranges, and to a lesser extent yellows. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm editing is to actually just up the luminance in the oranges, and a little bit in the reds, and a little bit in the yellows, because this does get rid of some of the color around people's faces, and it also draws the eye more to the face because you've added light to that area of the image. Next thing you want to do, which is kind of the obvious one, is to go to saturation. So what you want to do with saturation is actually lower the oranges and lower the reds, and to a lesser extent lower the yellows. And what this does is pretty obvious, but it removes that color from the image as much as you want. You can also increase it, but obviously for this type of image you don't want to do that. Sometimes I'll do that if I'm taking outdoor portraits and I want to make the green on grass or something look brighter. I'll up the greens. But here, really, the only colors in the images are the reds and oranges. The issue with this particular venue is that there are certain expectations that certain things in the image are going to be red. So when you start messing with the colors here, you're also messing with the sign. But I'll show you in a minute how to correct for that. The last thing is to go into the hues. And this is something that I know a lot of photographers don't touch, especially when they're working with people. I like to mess with it. I do it a lot when I'm doing landscapes and cityscapes to make the sky look those cool funky colors that you can see on my Instagram page. But what you can actually do here is, you see how red his face still looks? A trick to making the face look less red is to actually go into the red hue and make all reds a little bit more orange. You see how already his face is starting to look a lot more natural? Now, for a minute we were going to pretend that this sign wasn't here. We could actually pretty much go just on his face, messing with the reds and the oranges, until you get a more natural skin tone. You can mess with the yellows a little bit, but I found that when you have such high intensity reds, you usually can't do much with the yellows. Yeah, I'm afraid that we're giving him a more sickly look, so I actually don't want to touch that too much. So, now the question is, how do we get some red back in this sign? Now, the way that I like to do that, since it's one uniform red, is to actually go into my brush adjustment layer, and in the effects, hit color, and you see down on the bottom here, I've already selected a very red shade, and I've got it up to 100%. And from here, I just color in the flag. And it looks like when I was editing this photo before, I forgot to take out the original edit I did on that. So let me show you. This is what it would have looked like before I had the chance to edit it at all. I had forgotten to delete that when I started this tutorial. So now you really see the difference. How good his face looks, but how bad the flag looks, because people's expectation is that the Crossroads flag is going to be red. So now we go in and we shade this whole area. You'll notice I have a pretty thin feather on my brush right now, because I actually don't want there to be, I don't want any of the red bleeding over into his jacket, because his jacket is supposed to be white, so I keep that pretty close to home there. And I just add some red. And the same way that light reduces color, if you go in and you reduce the highlights, that'll actually make the flag look more red also. Now that's a little more than I want. I'd recommend going maybe only by 10 or so, because there is an expectation that there are some lights hitting Todd, so that means there are some hitting the flag too. So it's okay that there's some inconsistency, that just makes it look natural. So there we go, already you're seeing how much better this image looks, just by messing with the general white balance and with the individual color adjustments. The last thing I'm going to recommend when you're doing color editing post-process for concert images is to go into what's called split toning. A lot of people overlook the individual colorizing options and go right to split toning. The issue with split toning is it's kind of the same thing as what happens here with the white balance, is that it affects the entire image. So you have to be really careful, because the smallest adjustment can really mess up all the other colors that you're using. So I recommend that whenever you work with the split toning options, you keep the saturations pretty low. So the first one I usually like to mess with is the shadows, because as you can see here, the shadows are pretty dark to begin with. There's not a whole lot of detail in them, and that means that less is going to go wrong if you mess with them. So you go into the shadows, And what you want to do is, the problem with this image is that it's very warm, right? Reds are very warm on the color chart. So what you're actually going to do is try to cancel out the warm colors with darker colors. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can easily open up on your computer complementary colors. So you see here how reds and oranges are opposite to greens and blues, which means when you do split toning, if you want to cancel out an orangey red, you want to use a kind of bluish green aqua color. So we'll go back into Lightroom, and now in our shadows, if you click that, you get the entire chart, which I really like to use. And we'll pick something around the bluish green there. This is obviously way too high, so I'm actually going to go down and adjust it. Your other option is to actually just, when you're clicking, to click further along. If you're up here, that's high saturation. If you're down here, that's lower. So you see how much better and cooler that makes the image, but I'm keeping it very low, somewhere around 15 or 12. And that really does a very good job of cleaning it up, but just very subtly. Highlights I want to say be even more careful of, because the highlights are where his face and details on the jacket are. So you can go into highlights. So highlights, I recommend keeping it even lighter. So you have something around there, and maybe I'm just going to tap that and type that in, maybe use like 7 or so. Last thing I recommend is when you're doing this to keep the balance a little more towards the shadows. So there you go. Those are the best color edits I have.